Welcome back to the Mindful Masculinity podcast. Today's conversation is extremely important to me, especially important to me. For the last few years, we've been relentless in this masculinity space. We're citing statistics about male loneliness, declining wages, fewer friendships. You've heard it all. We've heard powerful voices, and I've been writing about those voices lately. Richard Reeves, Scott Galloway, Terry Real. And they're framing what they see as this crisis of boys and men. But here's the question: are we actually listening to the full spectrum of men, especially people who come from a generation that looks nothing like these speakers? My guest today is Jai Benson, and he represents a generational vantage point that gets too little of this space. Gen Z. In his Substack essay, Band-Aids and Boomerisms, Jay recently argued that much of today's masculinity conversation lacks imagination. And I believe Jay is onto something because my concern is we're at the point where we're going to repeat the same old mistakes and solve none of the problems that we've been going through over the last 70 to 80 years here in the United States and elsewhere. Policy prescriptions, dating advice, all of the stuff that we hear from these commentators might be missing the deeper cultural shifts that are already underway. So today we're going to talk about real life, about work, about dating, male friendship, fatherhood hopes, what young men are actually experiencing, and whether today's loudest masculinity debates really reflect the reality or they obscure it. Jay, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I have been waiting for this, and your December 22 Substack was spot on. It was something I really appreciated seeing from someone that doesn't get a chance to sort of have platforms all the time. You tell us a little bit about yourself first. Your approximate age, if you don't want to say your specific age, where you're based out of, your interest in terms of career and hobbies, so that we have a little bit of a flavor for who you are.
Well, I'm Jay. I'm 25. I'm based in Belgium at the minute. I'm studying a master's in quantitative social science, but I'm originally from Belfast, Northern Ireland. In terms of hobbies and stuff, like my life now, I was working in pharmaceutical market research for the last year and a half. Got fired from that. It wasn't really my thing. And now I'm kind of looking and trying to break into the masculinity space, maybe doing a PhD, maybe going into policy research, stuff like that. So that's kind of where I'm at. I'm now at the minute trying to like do a job that I want to do in this space that doesn't involve making PowerPoints all day, if possible.
I can tell you, having spent 2 decades working on PowerPoints, that might be a pretty good idea. You've had a fascinating start to your career, and I so appreciate the fact that you're looking at something for your master's that actually seems to be following your passion, or at least your writing passion. I know you have other passions, including sports. Jay is an exceptional national level athlete in track and field, and you're going to be competing soon.
Yes, next weekend back in Dublin for national championships. So looking forward to that. Been training all winter, so hopefully we'll see some fruition from that.
That'll be great. Hopefully, we'll be able to catch you on a YouTube video or something, coverage from the event. Discussing first what life is like for you as a man, do you feel like the conversation that's happening today, the statistics that we're hearing, I don't know about over in Europe, but here in the United States, the articles are just relentless in every venue, whether it's about work or dating or male friendship. What exactly are people in your age group, in the groups that you travel with on a daily basis, what are they saying and thinking and doing today that does or does not reflect what this conversation looks like?
I think there's two things to say about it. The first thing is I think it's just a general sense of frustration, right? It sort of seems like even if you do all the right things. And this probably applies to men and women, but it maybe falls more harshly on men who are supposed to do all the things properly and be the providers and make the money. But you sort of get to this point where like the rents are so high and you do everything right and you still feel like there's still this financial insecurity that seems to be existing with everyone. It's like it seems like you have two choices in life at this point. You do all the right things, you go to university, you get your degree, you try and work, and the salaries haven't really increased. The rents are very, very high, which means you're sort of at this choice where it's like, if I want to pursue my passion or do anything that's outside of really these small bounds, there's no like there's no other way of approaching it. And or if you want to be financially secure, you got to tie yourself to a desk and work 70 hours a week in a major city. And it sort of feels like you're boxed into these tiny choices and there's no real way of escaping them. And you can just feel this frustration. I think the other thing is like when we read the statistics, there's a thing we don't realize. It's just like when we talk about this crisis of masculinity, it tends to be a crisis of working class masculinity rather than total masculinity. Because if you look at it, if you have a college degree and you are sort of educated, you live in a major cosmopolitan city, you're not going to be doing too badly. There might be this sense of economic frustration, but the social frustration doesn't sort of materialize in the same way. Whereas when you look at deaths of despair, suicide, marriage rates, all these things, and then I need to look into this more, but it seems to me that like it's these working class areas and these working class men, which the crisis of masculinity, if you want to call it, is falling on them more. Because once you unmoored somebody from their job, then the sort of spiral goes where like the community you live in has sort of started to denigrate. Then your status and where you place yourself in the world starts to fall away. Then marriages start to dissipate. Then if you're a young man trying to find yourself, trying to get to sort of fall in love to meet somebody is going to be more difficult. And this sort of spirals into this big frustration. Whereas like where I went to school, you had the whole spectrum of people. So in Northern Ireland, you don't schools are not selected by financial. Um, there's no like we don't have private schools where you pay to go to them. They're sort of academically, if you do well enough, you get in, which means you have this whole spectrum of people. You have very, very working class people up to pretty, economically secure people. And there was two boys that took their own lives while I was at school in my school. And you sort of look at that and you go, those weren't the people from the well-off communities. They weren't the people with the two parents who both had jobs and the thing. They were sort of the working class boys. And then we talk about education, and it seems bad, but you can almost see you take the sort of cohort of people at first year of school and you divide them up by class and you take those boys that maybe don't have the greatest start in life and they already started behind the eight ball and then it gets worse and worse. We know the stats are like 10 times more likely to get expelled than a woman at the same thing, educated or disciplined more badly. And then once you get behind it, then the job opportunities aren't there for you that they used to be. They used to be able to go and get a job in X, Y, and Z factory, get a job in the trades, do something. Those things aren't there for you anymore. And then the spiral keeps continuing. And then you look across and all the women, they're all in university, they're all doctors, they're all succeeding. And first of all, that's unmirroring for a man to be in that position. And then second of all, nobody seems to care about it. You can sort of sit there and say, you're in this position, the structural things of society don't seem to be there for you. And then you want to put your hand up and say, what about me? And society sort of tells you to shut up. You've had it too good for such a long time. And it's no wonder that this breeds such a amount of frustration. So I think the two things I would say is there is a class element to this. And then second of all, there's a structural element that like even sort of people who are succeeding can feel. And yet that's only going to be amplified 10 times for the people who aren't.
You said something a few seconds ago about how you feel like people aren't really listening. And that was the initial thing that happened between the two of us when I was writing and commenting. And your initial reaction to something I wrote was, but at least these people are talking about it. Do you find that you ever are able to break through to people when you say that, whether you're at a pub, whether you're, seeing an online comment thread, does anyone ever stop and say, oh, you don't feel seen and heard? Or do people say, shut up, men have had it good for too long, what are you whining about? Is there anyone who seems to be empathetic and actively listening and concerned about the challenges you just described?
I think so, but you got to be very careful in the way you go about it. So, like, basically, the reason I started writing about this because I found that like there is a way you can do it. Like, so I went to university in London. I spent 5 years there. A lot of my friends were like women, very successful, very politically active, engaged in a lot of like activism around campus rape culture, sexual assault, things like this. And I think I became a pretty good feminist. Like I was obviously politically active and engaged, but when I got to uni and I lived with like two girls who are now my best friends, I realized I didn't know a lot. I called myself a feminist, but not really, but I wasn't properly one. And I learned a lot from them. But anytime I would push back with, okay, I hear all these things you're saying, and like men are doing this, and I understand, but like, what about suicides? What about this? What about that? For a long, long time, it just wasn't registering at all. And over time, I did get better at like framing the discussion. And over time, we got to this point where they were like, okay, I see the point. I'm maybe not going to do activism about it, and I'm maybe not going to, it's not top of my priority list, but I can understand where it's coming from. But I think sometimes you need to sort of case the argument in ways that bring the people who are the people who are saying men have had it good for so long, patriarchy, we've been suffering for a long, long time. And it's sort of this thing of trying to tell people that, like, yes, the narrative in 1975 about, white men are the top of everything and like women are not getting anything, that was true then. But like the facts of the case have shifted. And that doesn't mean there wasn't societal oppression. That doesn't mean there's still not a patriarchy there, but the facts say otherwise in a lot of these cases. And sort of you would get a lot of my friends would say, but these men are terrible and they don't do this and they're whiny or they're either too macho masculine, it's not aggressive, or they're all depressed and not attractive. And I was like, first of all, is it any wonder they're not is it any wonder they're like this? But also if you want good men, you gotta have some empathy. Like the only thing I was trying to get was just a tiny bit of empathy. And I think once you phrase it like, right, if you want better men, we gotta empathize with them, then they won't have these sort of terrible, they won't have these bad negative outlooks on women. They won't have negative outlooks on society, but you've got to reach the hand and have some empathy for the struggle. If you don't have any, all you're doing is pushing them further and further and further into black pill narratives, into red pill narratives. Once you can sort of do the required lexical gymnastics to bring people along, they kind of do understand and they will. But it took me a couple of years to get better at discussing it. But I think even now we're reaching a societal tipping point, which I saw with my friends, which is now becoming more that people at least accept there's a problem. And at least once we accept there's a problem, that's the first step towards empathy, I think.
Am I correct in assessing what you just said to say you feel like women of your age see your male perspective, that they are more likely to not push back or feel attacked that you're asking for attention from men, that they are empathetic and interested in hearing your story?
No, I would say
No?
the sort of touch, like the sort of quick approach is always the shut up, like what do you mean? Like there's this, that, and the other, we
Right.
have all this stuff to deal with, like, but it takes a long, long time. Like it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over consistent periods of having like literal arguments sometimes, having to be like, please just listen to me. And over time, you do get this, but again, it's really, really is a process. And I think rightly so. And sometimes, when you have this, if you're a woman in this world, you have this narrative, rightly so in a lot of cases, men have done this to me and that to me and this other thing, but why should I care? And you have to firstly empathize with their position, then build the argument in a sort of semi-structural way, case it in a way that they understand there's going to be a benefit to them, and then you get the progress. But I think it's not easy. It takes a long, long time, and you have to be very careful. It's the same argument. I remember Richard Reeves having this argument with George from the Tin Men about whether you got to do this sort of land acknowledgements before you got to say yes, I appreciate there's patriarchy. I'm sort of doing it myself even in this conversation, but I think. And Richard Reeves was saying, well, we should do that. And George is saying, why should we? Like, if these problems are here, we should just say them. But it's like, no, if you want to bring people along, you've got to do it in a way that they actually want to listen to you. And I think if you don't do that, that initial reaction will just stay there and you'll never break past it.
I totally agree with that. And I find myself often doing that in my writing. It's hard. Ruth Whitman came out with her book about being a mother of boys and her concern. Did that make any difference? Did it make a splash at all for the dialogue about masculinity and younger men across the islands because it was a woman injecting her opinion, or did she sort of pass through the conversation and it didn't have or not negligible effect?
At least from my perspective, I didn't see much of an impact of it, to be
Yeah.
honest. But I don't engage that much with like UK mainstream media anymore, so I'm not too sure. Like she could have well
Right.
been on Good Morning Britain or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's my big worry about all of these things is we see people like Scott Galloway and his notes on being a man and Ruth Whitman and her book. It's a flash in the pan. And if we don't engage people in empathy and compassion so that they're motivated to do something. I mean, I remember getting out of college, becoming a quote unquote corporate person. I was a writer for 7 years. I covered the airline industry. And when I finally joined corporate America, I had a role in finance that allowed me to participate in lifting women up, women entrepreneurs, women business owners. Um, and I threw myself wholeheartedly into it because, to some degree, I was a child of an era, the feminist era. I was born in the 60s, young boy in the 70s. And it was a period where my eldest sibling, a sister, participated in fighting for women's rights. So it was, inculcated into me and something I truly believed in. I just feel like today, despite the fact that we have broader devices to inject opinions, into the public discourse, I feel like people like Ruth Whitman don't really make much of a difference. Do you feel that the conversation is, moving closer to a tipping point where we might have an activist movement on behalf of your generation? Are we getting to that place where it's not just a book that gets an interview that causes a stir in the papers and then it dies out?
I don't know. I think we have reached a point at least where this discussion is at least in the psyche of normal people. It's broken out of sort of red pill podcasting, and it is like, it's in the news. It's on Good Morning Britain, Good Morning America. Galloway's there
Right.
talking about the statistics. But I think the one thing we're really, really going to struggle with is seeing any sort of structural change, because that, I think, it just leaves a sour taste in everyone's mouth. I think, to say we're going to shift resources, even though we know educational disparities are so big, we know the suicidal disparities are so big, to advocate, for a ministry for men's health, for a direct government proposals towards these things. Imagine the state of affairs where we had educational affirmative action for men. That's never going to be a thing, at least in today's society, where anyone would say, "Yeah, I think that's a good idea." Because I would sit in like these, my study has always been around sociology, and these days it's sort of 70% women, maybe. Like, at least in every classroom I'm nearly in, and you would ask the people, should we have gender equality? Yes. Should we have, equal representation? Yes. Would you advocate for, lowering the standards, or, having some sort of programs that get more men into sociology? No. And it's like, we're at this point where we realize it's a problem, but I don't know how we shift the narrative to where there's going to be, this structural change. Because even in the essay I wrote last week, it was like, you always come up against women who say, the medical system has done X, Y, and Z. Like, men have been the default. And then you look at the research and like, that was true, but it's not true now. And like, there's like, the reason why men kill themselves at such a higher level is because we haven't put any research into the difference between how men, systematize depression, how women do. And there's 70% of therapists in the US are women. It's like, there is these gendered things in here, but like, to say, we should structurally change them, we should do stuff about them. That is the new shift we need to try and bring. And that is going to be infinitely harder than just pointing out these problems, because
Mhm.
it becomes a zero sum game. Then it's like, okay, if we're putting money towards this, it's not going towards something else. And when we'll say, well, it's not going towards this healthcare, it's not going towards this, and someone will say, what about this problem? What about that problem? And I think this is where we reach the issue where it's like, although the problems are in the psyche, I don't know if the strategies for aiding any of these things are going to become politically tenable anytime soon.
Listening to you right now and going back to December and your Band-Aids and Boomerisms essay, I am feeling a frustration that reminds me of that phrase that stuck with me from your Substack, that today's conversation, despite the volume of conversation, still lacks imagination. What caused you to sort of focus on that lax imagination concept? And have you seen or been a part of conversations where imagination had a positive result?
I think anytime there's a vacuum, the easiest thing to do is to revert back to the norm, right? So whenever men are sitting there going, I don't know how to act, Me Too's done this, like the dating is confusing. The easiest thing is to just go back to the scripts that worked. But it's like that's the thing that frustrated me about Galloway. It's like provide, protect, reproduce. They've been there for literally thousands of years. Like this is not a new framework. Like 1970s, Gilmore's writing about this, and it's like these things work, right? If you are lost and you do and you feel unmoored in your masculinity, wearing a tie and getting up in the morning and paying for the dates and doing all these things, they will work, but they work up until a point, and it's like the problems with masculinity was this rigidity. This rigidity will work up until a point. If you are very very lost in life, these things are useful. But there's so much more to being a man, and there's so much more that we can do, so much more that we can advocate for, and also these sort of rigid scripts, they don't work as although they do work, they don't work as well in a modern context. So like again, pay for the day is a perfect example. It's like again in 1980, yeah, but like now the woman you sit across from likely to be higher educated than you, likely to earn just as much money as you. She doesn't need you as a human wallet. Like signaling provider status by waving your wallet about doesn't have that same like sex appeal that it maybe did 50 years ago. Like it's not dominance that people want, it's competence. Like they don't want you, like they don't need you to lift them up, they just want you to not drag them down. Standing outside of these traditional red pill, earn loads of money, be an alpha kind of ways. Like, although that looks like a successful strategy online, that is not the real world at all. I think if we could shift the script and be more imaginative, like you realize stepping outside of the traditional masculine traits is actually more successful. That is a thing that will get you more success in dating and in life. Like women, society, everyone wants more than that. And like if you think that this is if you think this is all you can be to be a man, it's depressing, it's not imaginative. And you will actually be more successful in life if you step out of these things. Like the one thing I've learned from my life is the more I stepped out of the rigid box of masculinity, the more successful I was with women, the more successful I was in life, and the happier I was.
Is this kid clavicular? Is he, popping up in conversations in Europe, in Ireland? What's his status in your community?
It's only new, and I don't fully understand it, but it's like again, it's one of these things. It's like right, this is so far removed from the reality of the real world that like, yes, obviously a super successful, handsome guy is going to get women, but that doesn't mean that's a script that that's going to work. The girl who sits beside you in class, or someone who like your coworker at the bar, like
Is he grabbing attention in your age group?
I don't know about my age group. I know on Twitter and stuff, like I don't know if the 16, 17
Right,
year old boy is sitting down and he's watching, kick streams and Twitch and he's watching these guys walk about. It seems like
right,
that it seems like that from what I see online. I don't know if that's to be true. I would need to ask them. I hope
right.
not, but like again, it's just noticing that like this is so far removed from the real world that like it's not a script we should be, holding up, but it seems like it is one, and that's the dangerous part.
Yeah. The reason why I bring it up is I had stumbled on him because of a traditional voice in the masculinity space who mentioned him during an interview. And I can't even remember at this point, but it was 3 or 4 months ago. I first kind of heard about this clavicular and I'm like, what? And I didn't look into it until about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I stumbled across a video of a male influencer. I think he's out of Boston. At least his accent sounds like he's from Boston. And for some reason, he did a reaction video to a series of clavicular videos. And there was this one video, and if I think I remember correctly, clavicular and some other guy friends rent a yacht, somehow advertise it to women to get them to come to the yacht. Whenever he approached them, they wanted nothing to do with him. He was so awkward in real life with women. It was such a revealing moment to your point that it doesn't really work. No matter how many times he smashes his face and focuses on his, you know, all the ratios of symmetry in a man's body and these women still were looking for someone who they could talk to, who could charm them in a way that wasn't to seduce them into bed. And if anything proved to young men that the old scripts don't work, it's a clavicular video.
Yeah, I guess this is true, but then I think sometimes you'll have a lot of people look at that and they'll just see the women, they'll see the boat, and they'll be like, okay, this is what I need to do, or they'll see Sneeko or whoever these other clampets are doing all the same stuff. And it's like, yeah,
Right.
the one thing I would just stress is just it's not reality. Like it is so far from like it is not close to the normal interactions you have on a daily basis. Like this has always been true. People always fancy, these millionaire celebrities, but like that's not what's going to work when you're sitting across from the girl at a university course or somebody you just met on Hinge. Like real life is different. Like you see it in the research all the time. You ask men and women what they want from a partner, you get them to list them, and they go on like dates or they go on like a speed dating thing, and the people they connect with, the people they actually want to continue with, not even the
Yeah.
correlation is basically zero between what they
Right.
say and what they end up wanting. So I think yeah, it's just like we need to be able to show that breaking out of these scripts is actually the thing that will make you successful in the real world. And I think currently we still think that, the sort of alpha money approach is the thing that will be successful. And I think maybe for initial attraction and maybe sometimes, but like in general, like it also seems to me a very depressing script to be like, I'm going to suppress all these things I would rather do, like these things I actually care about, these passions I have. Maybe I do like things that are unconventionally girly or whatever. I'm going to suppress all those and just be this sort of facsimile of, this sort of alpha person that, Andrew Tate told me to be. And I'm going to sacrifice all these things and work fucking 100 hours a week just to earn money, just so I think someone will fancy me. It's like, look, there's so much more to this life. And it's like, also, if we can change that little barrier that says, look, these other approaches will actually make you successful too. But there's no there doesn't seem to be anything online or any sort of archetype you can look up to which tells you, maybe being a bit more sensitive, maybe not enforcing your mask. Like I think the way to frame is I don't think women want to be a canvas for you to perform your masculinity on. And like showing that like that approach will actually make you quite successful on dates and in life is something we can do, but there just is there's no archetype for it. There's no sort of like there's you don't scroll down your Twitter and see anything like that. So I think young men and young boys sort of assume that the only way to success, if you're not getting any, is through these very rigid scripts. And although they might get you success, like there is so much more there could be, but like there's no influencers or there's no platform which is saying that and providing, steps to achieve it.
I love what you just framed something very beautifully in my head by referencing Paul Eastwick's work on speed dating. Because the interesting thing about that is here are the facts that could actually help men. But the people who possess those facts, who put these lab experiments into action, don't know how to be clavicular, don't know how to be Scott Galloway. They don't have the talent that injects this truth into the conversation so both men and women can say, that's my influencer. That's the person I want to listen to. They don't know how to do TikTok. I listen to Scott Galloway, unfortunately, way too much.
Me too.
Um, one of the things that always disturbs me, or disturbed me very early on when I first started seeing Galloway about 18 months ago, I had always known about him, but I don't follow him. But when I saw some clips on Instagram Reels where he was talking about how men on dating apps are, the whole Chad thing, that 10% of men get 80% of the attention from women, and he starts quoting a survey as if it's fact and truth. What he's quoting is like a 14-year-old study done on either Hinge or it was one of the apps. It wasn't even a study, it was analysis of only their paid membership. And while there's some truth to what he says about how difficult it is because men are much more active on apps for a reason, women have to be more selective because there's crazy guys out there trying to hurt them. While there's some kernels of truth to all that, it's really not that bad. I mean, it's or not as bad as he makes it out to be. And that's what bothers me is I wish Galloway would grasp truth and do what he does so well. Because I think that could break through. There's a little imagination. Do you think that that stuff will ever be translatable to the digital, media so that we can break through?
Part of me would love to do it. I just don't. It's one of those ones where like I don't have the confidence enough to like. It's easy enough to write on Substack, but like starting a TikTok or an Instagram and really putting your face out there is like I want to sort of talk about stuff in detailed manners and like again trying to explain the nuances of regression or causal analysis or all these things becomes a bit complicated. But one thing I would say on the dating app scenario is like again the research comes up against reality sometimes where it's like I used to do this thing with my friends all the time. They'd be complaining about I can't go on a date with anyone. I was like, literally, you could go on your phone to this hour and have someone going on a date with you if you're a woman. Like, and it would let you get up my hinge, get up her hinge. Like, I'm not joking. Like, we're talking 200, 300, 400 potential likes, and I'm sitting here with like six. And you're like, you can see this like asymmetry straight away. But like again, if you take yourself out of the sort of online world, and we again, Galloway threw us out the statistics, 45% of men haven't asked out a woman, and blame it on me too. And it's like, hold on, yes, true. But again, if you're going to approach women into sort of alpha silliness and this cold approaching nonsense, like that barely worked in the 70s. It still doesn't really work now. Like really, like become friends with women, learn how to interact in these ways. It's not gay. There's nothing wrong with it. Like like have platonic female friendships, learn how to interact in sort of in these groups, and you will start to radiate some confidence, and people will start to become attracted to you. Like if you want to do this masculine performance, I think the way I always do it is like you ever go to a wedding, and what you'll see is all the women are having a great time. They're all chatting to each other. They're all dancing. And what are the men doing? They're all standing on the sidelines, drinking pints, barely talking to anyone. And I was like, that's just a depressing like scenario. You go to a dinner party and the men sitting on the sideline and don't really talk, and all the women are sitting around the table. I was like, no, like that's like maybe that was masculine years ago, but no, be in the table with a woman, be able to hold a conversation about gossip or whatever's going on, be able to like emotionally connect, be able to be, oh, who are you dating? What's the story? Be able to have conversations that are not going to go anywhere. Like not every interaction you have with a woman or anyone has to have an outcome. Just be interested in people. Like, but again, men will be like, oh, I'm not going to dance at the wedding. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to just have a female. And it's like, no, like there's so much more you can do and it'll make your life better. And again, the key thing, it will actually make you more successful in things you want to be.
I want to go back to something that you've written about because it relates to what we just talked about. You specifically wrote that policy initiatives don't work in a vacuum and that cultural shifts have to accompany policy initiatives. And I totally believe what you say. And we actually see it in the history of feminism. Feminism didn't work because a bunch of legislators got together in the United States and pushed through Title IX, focused on eliminating restrictions from banks for women getting loans. There was a cultural shift that started that gave permission to both men and to women, because women were still fighting for their rights in the United States, gave them permission to have these conversations and gain empathy and compassion. Um, how much do you see this already happening in your generation, that there is a cultural shift? Do you see cultural shifts happening that might precipitate, the ability for us to do things about this masculinity crisis?
I think I think we're at a point now where we're right on the middle of like it can go either way. And I think sadly we're nearly at the point where we're shifting backwards, like which is a bit depressing because like it seems that when the more we talk about this and the more men and the narrative becomes more sort of aggressive and victimy that we want to like you see it with like these new Christian sort of like the sort of the God fearing alpha kind of Christian influencer kind of guy who's like we've become this sort of permissive society and we need to all find God and religion and come back to like traditional families and stuff like that, and you see a lot of the reaction is dragging us back the ways. And again, this could be another thing where it's like, right, does the online world reflect reality? And I'm trying to think like at least in the circles I move in, I do think that the cultural shifts are happening. But again, I think this also might have a class and like a class and divide dimension as well. Whereas I think if you again, it's something I've said before. It's like if you have the necessary receipts of masculinity, it gives you the freedom to then expand it more. It allows you to shift. It allows you to culturally shift because you're not as insecure as you were in these things. So if I think about one of my friends that I know, guy, like it's sort of an archetype I'm thinking of is like the evolved bloke. And I think this is kind of what we want to strive towards. It's like women are kind of there's two things. We want an archetype for men that like respects sort of the ancient drive for personal power, but comes with this new sort of way of like emotional health and sensibility. And it takes away the kind of nastiness that we used to have in masculinity. It sort of sands off the rough edges. And I think if we think about that archetype, and then women kind of say, look, I still want somebody who's inherently masculine at heart, but like I don't want all this silliness. I don't want all this bravado and aggression and stuff like that. And I sort of need him to be my partner, not I don't want dominance. I want confidence. I want emotional intelligence. And I was thinking like when I think about it, the archetype I would like to strive for this cultural shift is this kind of evolved bloke. So it's a guy, you know, maybe he's never heard of like bell hooks and he's never really read much feminism, but like he's raised well, he respects his mum, he likes pints, he sits down in the pub, but at the same time, he's grown up, he's read some books, he's interacted, he's empathetic with women, he kind of understands. And it's like this kind of day that like sort of baseline masculinity is still there. He's still a man, he's still rough hands and he still likes pints, but like he's more than that. Whatever that is, either he likes to dance at weddings or like he loves philosophy or he goes to galleries and he's sort of or like he loves his kids or whatever it is. Like he's that sort of baseline structural man, but he's more. He's got and that could be anything you want. And I think that's the cultural shift we need. I don't think you get the freedom in the same way like in North Belfast. I don't think you get the same freedom to not be these scripts like you. So I think there's two strands to it. It's like I do see the cultural shifts happening. I see them happening in one place, and there's a certain shift I would like to see, but at the same time, I don't know how you shift the playing field so that it's easier for boys and men in those more working class areas to first of all have the structural things in place that allow them
Yeah.
that baseline, you place the cultural narrative on top, which allows them to get away from this kind of like we're all sitting in the pub drinking pints, talking about women and football, and that's all we do.
Do you follow Chris Williamson at all?
Chris Williamson is probably being, he might be my most listened to person, maybe
Okay.
ever in podcasts.
How does he come across to you? Because I see him platforming people like Louise Perry. And I wonder about Chris Williamson because I hear a subtext in Williamson that I'm still trying to understand. What do you hear when you listen to him and not just his podcast guests, but the conversations that he's holding, the people that he's inviting, and whether or not he assents to their opinions?
I think Williamson is like almost, he's like the canary in the coal mine for this whole discussion, right? Because I think both sides kind of misinterpret the point. Like if you talk to women and they talk about Chris Williamson, they sort of throw him in with Rogan, Tate, Manosphere, and it's like, hold on, that's a complicated spectrum of people. And I think this is a game where it could be frustrating as a man. Like I spent a lot of time decoding Williamson to people who didn't understand him or that sort of whole thing. It's like, hold on, evolutionary psychology and all these things, like like there's truths in these things. Like this is not men sitting down in some sort of misogyny factory. This is some guy being like, oh, I kind of want to what should I take a magnesium before I go to sleep? And oh, what is fucking what does the history of the Saharan plains tell us about dating dynamics in the modern world? Like it's not this sort of breeding of misogyny, but I think what he's sort of starting to revert into is this like birth rate decline and sort of the sort of problems of the sexual revolution and all these things. And it's like again, you need to be able to have these discussions and talk about them. But I think sometimes he's starting to put the blame on women a bit more than they should. Because he's like, look at Japan, look at all these places, the birth rate's falling. And it's like, well, because we've had this permissive feminism for so long. And Louise Perry started talking about it. And again, there is the excesses of permissive feminism can go good or bad. But like I think Williamson is a good example of like people need to be able to use their own minds. Like people who watch these things or have their own agency. And like
Right.
most people are watching them because they're interested in the world and they want to know things and the guests are interesting. And like for me, I think I learned a lot. I do think that Williamson and all these people, if interacted with properly, you do become a better person by watching them. Like it's not like you're not learning some sort of toxic misogyny or anything like this. But again, you have to be able to approach the guests with nuance.
It's, yeah, my concern with Williamson, and I don't listen as much to his guests that are sort of outside my sphere of psychology, gender, gender trends, norms. But when he does, I do hear a subtext of more traditional masculinity, like you said. When he interviews Louise Perry, and I think he's done it twice now, he gives her so much space without challenging her. And she clearly has an agenda. She is not speaking from a place of interest in listening to both sides. She thinks feminism was a failure. She thinks feminism has sold too many stories to women, and as a result, women are unhappy. And I never hear Williamson say to people like Perry, "Whoa, let's have some imagination about this. What's the reinvention of everything instead of going backwards?" Because Louise Perry wants to take us back 30 years. That's her agenda. And I wish someone with a platform as large as Williamson said he would do it. Steve Bartlett is another one, CEO, Diary of the CEO. He rarely really digs deep. And here's the fascinating thing for me. I recently listened to Trevor Noah's interview of Scott Galloway. He held Galloway's feet to the fire. Galloway tried his shtick with Noah, and Noah has rotating guests, and I forget the name of the woman who was his guest for the Galloway interview. But he pushed back on Galloway on a couple of things. And Galloway was kind of caught off guard. He's not used to someone saying, "Really? Explain that to me more," or "I see a contradiction," or I want to challenge that.
Like again, you have to give, at least for me, like you have to assume the agency of the viewer rather than blame the platform. It's like I learned a lot from Peterson. I learned a lot, and people say like, "What do you mean these people are idiots?" I'm like, no, like they're they're educated people. Like everyone's wrong about some stuff, but they're not exactly bad. Like Peterson did a lot of good for people. Doesn't mean he hasn't fallen completely off the rails now, but like this whole clean your room, like a lot of men got out of serious depressions. Like you could go to these halls, there's 5,000 men all wearing suits, and he comes up and there's people crying, being like, "You changed my life." It's not like these guys didn't do good things. But again,
Right.
doesn't mean Eric Weinstein and Brett, like, I think they're a good platform for intellectual curiosity. They're a good platform for like learning about things. But again, you've got to have the intellectual agency to, separate the wheat from the chaff. You've got to be able to go, I could take a bit of this, I could take a bit of that. I'm going to form my own worldview. And I think the problem comes in whenever we assume that all these men watching these things are becoming, some sort of intellectually captured people. It's like it was good for me, and like I was able to then go, I'm not sure about this, not sure about that. I'll look further into this. But again, without them, I don't have a foothold into the game at all.
Mm-hmm. It's I love what you're saying about agency, because agency, I would add a bunch of phrases around the circle of agency. Intellectual curiosity, the desire to listen to something and then go Google it and see what other resources say about that theory, that assumption. Um, you know, Not feeling aggrieved to me is part of agency, because when you feel aggrieved, you're more likely to listen to an empathetic, sympathetic voice like Peterson's and go, "Yeah, men are the victims." Because he does. He plays the male victim narrative ridiculously. Um, and that, what I worry about is if you don't have these other things around agency, these abilities, um, it does start sending you down this bell curve from, people who are objective at the top, try to look at data, are willing to be challenged, are willing to have objective discussions, test and learn. I feel like when you start sliding towards the black pill, the red pill, and ultimately, you know, Andrew Tate at the bottom, you've got these people that sort of put you on the slippery slope. And I think of Galloway at sort of that top right of the bell curve. He's playing into old ways of thinking about men and not having imagination. And that then sends a man who's struggling to stay objective, to respect women, it sends them to the next person. And to me, Chris Williamson is down a little bit to the right from Galloway because I don't think I hear feminist, phrases, and I don't see feminist guests on Williamson's podcast. I don't see conversations with women who say, what happens to us is very real. And we want to be allies with men, but men need to be understanding of what we go through just by our physical stature, by our ability to reproduce, blah, blah, blah. I don't see him doing that. I see him platforming Louise Perry. I see him platforming Jordan Peterson. I see him, giving voice to this thing that then leads the man to the next thing if he doesn't have agency. Do you find amongst men your age that there is agency, there is intellectual curiosity, there is a desire to probe deeper when they hear people, on these popular channels?
I think there's a lot there. I'm not sure, at least from people I know, how many people are really spending that much time in the Williamson Rogan podcasting verse, at least that I know. Like,
Right.
and this is where I'm not sure, like, I think we need to be careful. Like, I'm not sure that the sort of Williamson people are sliding people into down this curve in the way that you're saying, because I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
them, because I think if we take the average person who'd even be watching a Williamson video, they're already going to be sort of an intellectually curious person, and we're treating this as the main brow of the internet, but like that's the
Yeah.
top of the iceberg. The iceberg goes a lot deeper, and like the rate, I think we're getting close to conflating a sort of fake danger with a real danger. Right? I don't think the Rogan Williamson listeners are the danger. I think the real danger is like when you really dive into the literature and you go into like really dangerous online communities and you get into the 4chan incel black pill space. That's where the real danger is. And sometimes I think that like I do like I think the way they approach the world is a fundamentally different approach, right? One narrative, the black pill narrative, sort of says I'm a victim, society is gynocentric, and this, that, and the other. And I don't think that Rogan or Peterson or anyone else really promulgates that narrative. They sort of say, look, you're you're not a victim. You can fix yourself. It's a competence narrative. They say, look, there's here's the path to do it. Maybe it's eat deer meat and go to the gym and do ice baths. Maybe it's, do mindfulness meditation or whatever. So I think like usually that seems to be an antidote to the more negative things. It's not that this night is impossible, but like also most of the research tells us that like we have this idea in our head that when a young man goes on his TikTok and starts scrolling, he gets radicalized. Like he's watching videos about some guy bicep curling, and then 4 weeks later he's deep in incel ones and he's a misogynist. And the research tells you that's actually not true. What happened is we built this narrative, like the demand for the content was there, and then social media and creators came in and filled the void because we had this sort of scenario where like it's the causality is actually backwards, right? So there was this demand for there was this feeling of negative feelings and this frustration because economic precariousness, social atomization, cultural backlash against feminism, and all these things that we had. And it was in there. It was just sort of seething. And what happened was that demand was there. Influencers realized that the demand for it was there, and then they filled the void. Also, another interesting thing I found was like Bartlett and Williamson have finally broken through bro science into the mainstream. So like when they did their New Year's Day podcast, and he started talking about birth rates, and Bartlett started blaming women for birth rates and said, should we, is it a problem that men can't pass on their genes? Everyone started freaking out. And I was like, that's good. Like they need the sort of more people who aren't in their sphere to come down and maybe be like, whoa, chill out, guys. Like birth rates are a problem, but maybe stop blaming women for all of it. So yeah, I think to summarize, it's more like, yeah,
Start looking at the atomization of society that actually causes it. I mean,
yes,
instead of blaming two kids who would love to have a partnership and raise families, we know from self reported surveys that men still want to get married and have children. That it is not that they don't want to. There's something holding them back, and it's society. I think there's a moral panic right now about, the manosphere. And while Adolescence was a powerful series, I think it contributed too much to this holy crap, the web is, you know, turning our boys into demons. There's some truth to some small portion of that, but it's not at a pandemic level. It's not even
Yeah.
at a tipping point level, especially if we don't solve society's problems. I think you're totally onto that, and that is imagination.
It also goes to the point about adolescence, goes to your another point you said about like, right, what does the research say? Like you should push back. And like we had this sort of problem that like adolescence was the first thing to break into the into the sort of mainstream. But again, if you've spent 10 minutes in cell research, you know that like the story they're painting there is not even remotely close to accurate. Like, first of all, incels are most likely to be harmful to themselves and to society. Like the rate of suicidality within the incel community is so high. I think the rates of autism are extremely high. So you got this whole sort of nuanced discussion about incels and what they are, what they mean, how dangerous really are they, how big are they, and then you have adolescence breaks through, and we treat this as like the factual statement. And you're talking about pushing back, like there was very few people pushing back and say, whoa, right, okay, reasonable story, but like let's. And again, it's this sort of empathy versus reality kind of thing. It's like, right, if we want to solve the incel problem, you got to lead with empathy, because like we have this picture in our head it's going to be some guy going and shooting people or something, but it's not. Usually they're killing themselves. They have this terrible viewpoint of their own selves. Like it's a really depressing, which also is like, I find confusing when it's like, right, we shouldn't be judging men by their capacity for like sexual prowess, because this has all these sorts of negative issues, and then we use the very insult that negates the whole thing, that calling someone an incel being like, okay, you have no value unless you're sexually like available. It's which reinforces the very structure of like sexual success that we're trying to break down, and the whole thing doesn't make any sense. So again, like
Yeah.
sometimes I was said another thing when you're talking about like, can you bring people to this? Like another thing I learned was like when adolescence came out, then I would explain the data on incels and what they mean and what they are to people, and they go, oh, didn't know that, that's interesting. And I'd be like, oh, maybe we could solve this problem if we had a bit more empathy towards them. Like the scale of incel violence is tiny compared to the rate of suicidality. And they go, oh, that's interesting. Didn't know that. Also, and that's another thing we have to thank the Williamsons and stuff like that. He got on William Costello, who was the sort of, top level incel researcher, and challenged the narrative a bit. And you're like, so all these things are coming together to be like, there is positives to the Williamson thing if you can use it, find out. You can start making changes if you take the narrative, digest it properly, and then communicate it to people who maybe don't understand as well. So I think in that way, yeah, research backed stuff can be effective. The way you communicate it is also important.
I think that, especially today, the way you communicate it is the most critical factor. It's some of the skills that you've talked about, the making sure the acknowledgments land, that you acknowledge the existing situation that opposes what you're trying to achieve, so that you don't that you're asking for allyship without asking for it, because that does draw in compassion and empathy. I think this mix of skills to me is the imagination that may be able to break through, these unfortunate recurring cycles of masculinity crises. We do need to have imagination about this, because adolescence was riveting, but it also had a cementing of the narrative of boys and men that, I think if you watch certain portions of it, I think if you watch how the father's crying at the end of the show in his son's bedroom, and how he's asking his wife, did I fuck up? What did we do wrong? Um, I think that kind of nuance and complexity is good, because it makes people go, let's not blame this boy. Let's look at the whole structure of society, the school, the subtle message of the school atmosphere, that we're thinking that schools are a place where people go get educated, and yet what did we see in the school? Total chaos. Are we sending kids to school with respect for teachers, authority? Are we building schools that are less like prisons and more like places where kids can both learn and grow as human beings? There were so many subtle messages in that show, but what came across? The incel, dilemma. That's what was so powerful. And I think, like you said, it missed so much of the nuance of this conversation. Jay Benson, I do not say this lightly, but please, we need to hear more from you. We need to hear more from you on video. You do have a way of challenging me. You did it on several occasions today, and I greatly appreciate you sort of poking me a little bit. Um, I hope that you and I can continue this dialogue because I look at the people that I come across and they look way too much like me. And we are not the future of this world. We are sort of the past, and we can contribute to the future of this world, but we need to hear from people like you. So I hope this is the beginning of a dialogue that you and I can have on occasion, maybe every couple of months, where you bring up a new part of that nuance that doesn't get enough platforming because it's the only way we're going to break through is people have to stop listening to the same old, and they need, to hear the imagination of a person of your intellect and your lived experiences.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I hope we can do it again. This was great fun. And there's plenty more we could talk about. I could probably do this for another 6 hours. No issue.
So I'm going to wait for you to come up with the topic that you want to do. Jay Benson needs to be the Scott Galloway of the intellectual set.
Oh, well, well, this is the first podcast I've ever done, so it's a long way to go, but hopefully this can be a good start. So thank you for giving me a first start.
No, it was a privilege to hear your voice.
Thank you.
Okay. See you soon, Jay.